In early 1940, the German oil tanker Altmark was sailing through neutral Norwegian waters, trying to avoid detection by the powerful Royal Navy. The ship was carrying nearly 300 Allied prisoners of war, rescued from ships that had been sunk by the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee in the South Atlantic during the initial months of World War II. When a British aircraft spotted the Altmark, the ship took refuge in a fjord, escorted by a Norwegian vessel. Determined to free the prisoners, a British flotilla of 4 destroyers, led by HMS Cossack and its captain Philip Vian, was dispatched to track the German vessel. The British made multiple attempts to board the Altmark, but the Norwegian escort suddenly pointed its torpedo tubes at the Cossack, leading all 3 parties into a tense standoff. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, ordered Captain Vian to recover the prisoners and to use force only if absolutely necessary. The Germans, however, refused to yield. An intense hand-to-hand combat soon broke out. While the fighting was between the British and the Germans, the consequences of the incident would prove most severe for Norway. In late August 1939, before the war began, the Altmark had stopped at Port Arthur, Texas, to refuel. While on its return voyage across the Atlantic, the crew received news that war was imminent. The ship was then ordered to head for the South Atlantic to support the Admiral Graf Spee, a Deutschland-class heavy cruiser of the Kriegsmarine tasked with disrupting Allied merchant shipping. The Altmark would serve as a supply ship during these operations. On September 1st, after rendezvousing with the Graf Spee, the Altmark was outfitted with 2 20mm anti-aircraft guns and a small naval crew to handle its weapons and communications. While the official rules required Graf Spee to rescue the crews of the ships it sank, the standard practice was to transfer ordinary seamen to the Altmark during resupply operations. While officers stayed aboard the cruiser, conditions aboard the Altmark were harsh, and by late 1939, Graf Spee's successful patrols came to a halt when it was intercepted and heavily damaged by 3 Royal Navy cruisers. With no hope of escape, the crew scuttled the battleship in December. With the Graf Spee destroyed. Captain Heinrich Dow of the Altmark set course for Germany with the prisoners still on board. The journey would not be easy. By the start of the war, the Royal Navy controlled much of the sea, with many ships operating close to European waters in an effort to blockade Germany. Some released officers had also disclosed the Altmark's activities and the presence of prisoners on board. Supplies were running low as the Altmark remained in the South Atlantic for several weeks. Believing the safest route home lay around the British Isles via the north, Captain Dow decided to travel through the Norwegian coast. Disguised first as a Norwegian tanker and then as an American one, the Altmark managed to avoid British detection and passed south of Iceland before entering neutral Norwegian waters on February 14, 1940. Dow hoped to use Norway's neutral status to remain safe for a few days before making a quick dash across the Skagerrak, straight into Danish waters and back to Germany. Suspecting the Altmark carried British prisoners, Winston Churchill demanded that Norway search the vessel immediately. The Norwegians, cautious about jeopardizing their neutrality, reluctantly complied and sent a torpedo boat to inspect the ship. When questioned by authorities, Captain Dow openly identified the Altmark, but claimed it was simply a tanker returning from Texas, eager to end the incident quickly and avoid conflict. The Norwegian officials accepted his explanation without thoroughly inspecting the vessel and allowed it to continue through their waters. Nonetheless, reports later suggested that high-ranking Norwegian naval officers were aware of the Altmark's true mission and ordered it to be constantly escorted while in Norwegian territory. To Dow's dismay, and under British pressure, the ship was inspected 2 more times on February 15th. The officers asked detailed questions about the ship's armament and whether any non-Germans were on board, but Dow denied everything. During the 3rd inspection of the ship, the hidden prisoners began shouting, stomping, and banging on the walls in an attempt to draw attention. Despite the commotion, it remains unclear whether the Norwegian inspectors failed to hear the noise or simply chose to ignore it. While transporting prisoners through neutral waters wasn't technically illegal, Norwegian authorities refused to act without explicit instructions from their government. Nevertheless, Altmark was instructed to avoid the exclusion zone surrounding Bergen port, forcing her to pass through international waters where she would be vulnerable to attack by the Royal Navy. Captain Dow strongly objected to this directive, and even contacted the German embassy in Oslo. Eventually, Altmark was granted permission to pass through the exclusion zone. That same day. As Altmark moved through the zone, a British aircraft flying over Norway spotted the German tanker. A Royal Navy detachment, led by the destroyer HMS Cossack under Captain Philip Vian, was immediately dispatched to pursue the vessel and gather information. Upon interception, Altmark took shelter in the narrow Jusingfjord in southwestern Norway. Despite the neutral waters, Cossack continued the chase the following day. When the British approached Altmark, Norwegian escort ships blocked their path, and warned that they would open fire if any further boarding attempts were made. Uncertain of his next move, Captain Vian requested guidance from the Admiralty. In response, Churchill issued a clear directive: unless the Norwegian torpedo boat agreed to escort Altmark to Bergen with a joint Anglo-Norwegian guard on board. Vian was to board the ship, free the prisoners, and take control of it until further orders were given. If the Norwegians attempted to interfere, only the minimum necessary force was to be used. Vian requested permission to board Altmark alongside Norwegian personnel, but was denied once more. That evening, Altmark attempted to ram Cossack, but ran aground in the shallow waters of the fjord. Seizing the opportunity, Cossack moved in, and at 10:22 p.m., over 30 British sailors boarded the German ship. Although historical accounts differ on who initiated the confrontation, the British quickly gained the upper hand. With firearms rendered useless in the close quarters, the Royal Navy engaged the Germans in fierce hand-to-hand combat, wielding cutlasses in what became the last known instance of the Royal Navy using them in battle. This dramatic event came to be known as the Altmark Incident. 8 German crew members were killed, and about a dozen others were seriously wounded, including a Norwegian sailor from one of the torpedo boats. The Altmark's crew was quickly overwhelmed, and the remaining Germans surrendered. A search of the ship uncovered 299 prisoners of war. When one British sailor shouted, "The Navy's here," the prisoners erupted in celebration, and the phrase soon became a rallying cry throughout the rest of the war. HMS Cossack returned to port with the rescued prisoners on the afternoon of February 17, 1940. To widespread celebration in Britain, Churchill made full use of the moment, turning it into a powerful propaganda victory. Reports of the prisoners' suffering were heavily embellished to fuel outrage over alleged Nazi atrocities. While the Altmark incident boosted British morale, it had serious consequences for Norway. Norwegian officials were deeply angered by the British violation of their neutrality, though their general sympathy for the Allies meant no action was taken beyond formal diplomatic protests. Adolf Hitler, on the other hand, was furious. He believed the crew of the Altmark had failed to defend the ship properly, and the loss of 299 prisoners in exchange for a few German lives was intolerable. Until then, Hitler had hoped to maintain Norwegian neutrality to secure the continued shipment of Swedish iron ore through Norway, but the incident convinced him that Norway could no longer be trusted. To protect the annual delivery of over 11 million tons of Swedish ore, Hitler accelerated his invasion plans. Operation Weserübung was launched on April 9, with the objective of occupying both Denmark and Norway. Within 2 months, both countries had fallen to Nazi Germany, and the war in the West escalated into a new and brutal phase. During the third inspection of the ship, the hidden prisoners began shouting, stomping, and banging against the walls in an effort to draw attention. Despite the noise, it's uncertain whether the Norwegian officials failed to hear them or chose to ignore the signs. Although transporting prisoners through neutral waters was not explicitly illegal, Norwegian authorities decided not to intervene without direct orders from their government. Altmark was eventually instructed to avoid the exclusion zone near Bergen port, which meant the ship would have to pass through international waters where it risked being intercepted by the Royal Navy. Captain Dow strongly objected to this decision, and even reached out to the German embassy in Oslo. Following the protest, permission was granted for Altmark to pass through the exclusion zone after all. That same day, a British reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Altmark. A group of Royal Navy vessels, led by the destroyer HMS Cossack under Captain Philip Vian, was dispatched to locate and follow the German tanker. After being located by Cossack, Altmark took shelter in the narrow Jusingfjord in southwestern Norway. Undeterred, the British ship followed her the next day. When the British attempted to approach the Altmark, Norwegian escort vessels blocked them and warned that any boarding attempt would be met with gunfire. Captain Vian, uncertain of how to proceed, contacted the British Admiralty for guidance. In response, Churchill instructed him that unless the Norwegian escort agreed to accompany the Altmark to Bergen with a joint British and Norwegian crew, onboard Vian was to board the ship, release the prisoners, and take control of it while awaiting further instructions. If the Norwegians interfered, Vian was to use only the minimum necessary force. Vian again asked to board the Altmark with Norwegian cooperation but was denied. That evening, Altmark attempted to ram the Cossack but ran aground in the shallow waters of the fjord. Seizing the opportunity, the British moved in, and at 10:22 p.m., more than 30 Royal Navy sailors boarded the German ship. Accounts differ on which side initiated the fighting, but the British quickly overpowered the crew. In the tight quarters, where firearms were impractical, the sailors engaged in close combat using cutlasses. Marking the last known occasion the Royal Navy used such weapons in battle. The Altmark crew was overwhelmed in a brief but intense struggle, and 8 German sailors were killed. Around a dozen others were wounded, including a Norwegian who had been aboard one of the escort vessels. The Germans surrendered shortly afterward. Once the ship was secured, the British boarding party conducted a full search and discovered 299 Allied prisoners. When a British sailor shouted, "The Navy's here," the prisoners erupted in joy. A moment that later became symbolic and was often remembered during the remainder of the war. The HMS Cossack returned with the freed prisoners on the afternoon of February 17, 1940. The British public celebrated the success, and Churchill used the event to boost morale. Stories of the prisoners' suffering were exaggerated to strengthen claims about Nazi brutality. While the operation was a clear propaganda success for Britain, it had serious diplomatic consequences. Norwegian officials were deeply frustrated that British forces had violated their neutrality, but due to their general sympathy toward the Allied cause, they refrained from taking any action beyond formal protests. In Germany, the news enraged Hitler. He believed the Altmark's crew had failed to resist the British sufficiently and saw the loss of the prisoners as a disgrace. Until this moment, Hitler had hoped to preserve Norway's neutrality to maintain uninterrupted shipments of Swedish iron ore that passed through the country. The Altmark incident changed that calculation. Hitler concluded that Norway could no longer be trusted to protect this vital supply route. This shift in thinking prompted the acceleration of Germany's invasion plans. On April 9, Operation Weser was launched with the goal of occupying both Denmark and Norway. Within 2 months, both nations had fallen under German control, and the conflict in the west escalated dramatically.